Okay, all right, well, thank you very much for coming. And in the presentation this morning, I want to share with you some of the key ideas I've been exploring in my research around what might be understood by an inclusive pedagogy, or the inclusive pedagogical approach. So this is an area of work that I've been engaged with for a number of years now, working in collaboration with colleagues in schools and university, and particularly in terms of my writing recently with Lani Florian from the University of Edinburgh, and also more recently with Ruth Kirshner, a colleague of mine from Cambridge. And what I hope to explain more fully in the course of this hour is how our research has led to our developing understanding of what inclusive pedagogy might be. And in essence, it's a sort of fundamental shift in thinking in the minds of teachers away from more traditional approaches to inclusion that start with saying, well, yes, the child's included in the class, but actually when the teacher's planning and thinking pedagogically, they're thinking about most children as being okay and having to do something different for some. So that's that idea of most and some. So there's a sense that most children are fine, we can manage, but some children need something different or additional to. And in the pedagogical approach that I've been developing is moving away from that traditional starting point and looking at teachers whose pedagogical approach starts with everyone in the class. So everyone rather than most and some. And that's a key idea underpinning this work. And during this morning's session, I also should be reflecting on, for me, the significant contribution that teachers have made to our research, so hence the title, Learning with and from Teachers. And in doing so, I shall argue that in developing a deeper understanding of inclusive pedagogy, those of us who engage in research must learn with and from teachers based on a deep intellectual respect for the work that they do and the complexity of their daily practice. Okay, so this is just a broad outline of what I should be talking about today. So I'm going to give you some contextual background, a little bit of the theoretical orientation that shaped my research, and then that's to set the scene, but it's quite important to set the scene first before then moving on to the study itself that I did with Lani Florian. I'll tell you a little bit about that study and its key findings, and then end with some final reflections and conclusions. So the context is important. For me, I'm a long way from New Zealand, right over the other side of the world. And I'm absolutely delighted to be here in this beautiful country and based in Christchurch, and I am extremely honoured to have this opportunity to be a visiting fellow here. I've had a wonderful stay. As I said, I'm leaving tomorrow. I've enjoyed the beautiful countryside, also beautiful food and wine. But I am half a world away from my usual context. So I think it's important to recognise that here we are in the Fecky building here, but I'm actually usually based in this building here in Cambridge. And so my research has orientation towards England, towards the UK, and Europe, but I am interested, of course, in research that takes place elsewhere. And during my stay here in New Zealand, I have learnt so much about the kinds of work that's going on into the area of inclusive practice and inclusive education, and that's been really exciting for me because I've learnt a lot. So I just want to acknowledge that. But my views are shaped by my assumptions, my values and beliefs. And whilst I hope these will be of interest to you, I think it's important that you also reflect on your own. So like all of us in the room, we've been affected by our own experiences of education as a child and beyond. I taught in schools in England, and in my last couple of jobs I was head of the Learning Support Department, so the equivalent of a SENCO in secondary schools. I now work closely with many teachers, so I'm also a teacher educator as well as interested in research in education. I have a family of 3 children, so that's shaped my understanding of schools. I've helped bring them up through their schooling experiences, and I now have a grandson of 7, and so it's all starting again. And I think I have to acknowledge my partner who's here with me in New Zealand, who taught for 38 years as a teacher before he retired. So I think living with a teacher for all that time does also affect my understanding of schools. So I'm going to just set out some of the contexts that I think are important and have shaped my research recently. So the first contextual area I want to consider is around the marketisation of education. And that term's been around for a long time now, but I think we shouldn't ignore it because it's still part of our understanding of what's happening in schools, I think in New Zealand as well as in England. So politicians are increasingly concerned about the costs and outcomes of the education system in terms of its contribution to a nation's economic wealth and well-being. They ask questions like, does education bring value for money? Is it worth doing this? So when I was with the ministry in Wellington, some of the questions they were talking about, I had an opportunity to talk to people working there, was around, well, how can we show that this is worth spending money on? And that is a big question. But although governments in different countries have responded to these global economic concerns in different ways, one of the principles that underpin that around the notion of competition, choice and accountability. And the idea is that these are mechanisms that will raise academic standards of individual students, schools and nations. And these neoliberal influences, although Powie and Whitty referred to this as the marketisation of education back in 1999, are still very strong. So in England, we continue to measure children's academic performance through standardised testing. And the results of those tests shape decisions about children's lives and the future of schools. At school level, those results are made public in performance tables. Schools are inspected and categorised, and the findings of tests and inspections are intended to inform parental choice. And the idea is that this will raise standards across systems. However, this discourse of standards relies on the idea of a so-called normal distribution, which implies in this ranking of children, schools and nations, for example in PISA tests, that there are winners and inevitably losers. For me, that's the nature of marketisation and competition. And for some, this understanding of education is underpinned by a sense of injustice. And specifically in terms of inclusive education, I think it really challenges us to find alternative ways to think about learner diversity, ways of learning and being a learner, and ways that we assess learning. So the focus on costs and outcomes is important for governments, but can be, I would argue, in tension with some of the principles underpinning inclusion. So while national governments in many countries have continued to enact policies to promote more inclusive education systems, tensions have then emerged as a result of the conflicts between, on the one hand, the market-based reforms, winners and losers, competition, and on the other hand, principles based on equity and social justice around inclusion. And I don't think these have been straightforward to resolve. So, for example, in an earlier research project, the one I'm going to talk about today, with my colleagues Lani Florian and Martin Rouse, we explored that enduring and widespread perception that's held amongst some politicians, parents and indeed practitioners, that the inclusion of certain children and young people with identified special educational needs or learning difficulties are seen as having a detrimental effect on the achievement of other children in the school. Now, in our research, we could show quite categorically that isn't necessarily the case. However, there's still real concerns that this emphasis on the standards agenda has not fully addressed the underachievement of some individuals and groups of students who are marginalised from education and do not feel they have much to show for their time spent in schools. So what then does that mean for inclusive pedagogy? So although these neoliberal ideas have been around now for some time, I think we've just got used to them, but we forget sometimes the influence that they still bear. And then in terms of my research, a really important other contextual concern is responses to diversity in classrooms and schools. Across many countries, schools are becoming increasingly diverse in their student intake. I don't know how if you were reflecting on your own particular national context, what that would mean to you. In England, it's not only with regard to children who in the past might have attended special schools and now are placed within mainstream settings, but also there's greater diversity in English schools in terms of ethnicity, cultures, language spoken, as well as disability status, and so forth. I don't see that as a negative aspect of education, but it's part of the change that we see in our classrooms. Yet even so, despite that increasing diversity, there's still this pedagogical view around the idea that there are most learners in the classroom. There's some kind of homogenous group, and there are others who don't fit. And that traditional view of inclusion is what I'm challenging. And as Lani Florian writes here, the inherent bias in systems that are designed for most students on the grounds that something different can be made available to some tends to pathologize linguistic, cultural, cognitive, and other kinds of differences. And she goes on to argue that doing so disproportionately affects students who are members of ethnic minority groups and those living in poverty. So again, for me, it seems important to think about more flexible, complex and holistic approaches to respond sensitively and appropriately to learner diversity. And that challenges us to think about what pedagogy for inclusion would be. In this quotation here by Robin Alexander, he undertook a really interesting large-scale longitudinal review of primary education in England. And what he's saying here is, furthermore, even just focusing on single dimensions of difference, which the most and some approach tends to do, has to be inadequate, because it cannot take into account the complex experiences and interactions which are the reality of children's lives. So if we think about difference as being a condition of what it is to be human for any of us, part of the human condition is to be different, and then we think about our own multiple and shifting identities, then how are teachers to find ways to respect and respond to human differences in ways that include all learners in, rather than exclude some from, what is ordinarily available in the daily life of the classroom? So this brings me to my third contextual point. So this is really important for me in thinking about my work in trying to understand what an inclusive pedagogy is. And thinking about teachers' experiences of inclusive education is of international concern. So these points here in a way summarise a large number of international research studies into what teachers' views are of their experiences of inclusive education. And it's seen that despite changes by governments of many countries over the last few decades which have introduced legislation intended to promote more inclusive education systems, the necessary corresponding developments in classroom practice do not seem to have been so easily achieved. So the studies that I've referred to show that on the one hand, most teachers generally express a very strong commitment to the principles and values of inclusive education. I mean, that's quite straightforward. I can see that when I'm working with student teachers, recently qualified teachers as well. However, on the other hand, they're very anxious about how best to meet classrooms with increasingly diverse range of learners. So that was the second context that I referred to. And furthermore, the effect of this is for teachers to feel deskilled and believe they do not have the skills they need to meet the different needs of all the different children they encounter. So there's this strong sense that teachers need to know about children with this particular learning difficulty or this particular disability, and there is no end to the things they feel they don't know. That's not to argue that knowledge about autism or Down syndrome or English as an additional language isn't really important. But if our traditional views of inclusion, where we think about most children as being okay, but something different having to be done for all these some, and we think about how classes become increasingly diverse, then teachers are likely to feel deskilled because it's just going to feel overwhelming. And I don't know whether this is true in New Zealand, but the attrition rates for teachers in England are quite high, and this is seen as part of the contributing problems. Furthermore, And significantly for those of us who research in this area, and by that I include myself, is many teachers feel that the research literature doesn't help them solve these problems. So they don't think, oh, just go and read that really exciting journal article, because that will tell me what to do. They just don't feel engaged with that. So I feel a real moral responsibility to take that into account in my research. I don't know how successful I am, but it really matters to me. What kinds of research should we be doing into inclusive classroom practices if we really want our findings to make a difference to teachers' experiences, make them feel more enthusiastic and excited and competent and confident about their work, but also obviously to support the learning of all children and young people. So this brings me to my final context, which is the contribution of research. I think this really must matter to those of us who have the opportunity and privilege to engage in research in this area. So on this slide, I've just put two references, and I think they're really interesting references to follow up if you are interested in this field. They're both large-scale overviews of inclusive practice. So the article by Tillis and his colleagues looks at what might be understood by inclusive schools, and then the second half of this large-scale international review looks at inclusive classrooms. So it's nearly a decade ago, and he noted that many studies looking at the level of the classroom are too often one-dimensional. They focus on one child in the class or one programme and do not take proper account of the complexity of everyday classroom life. And therefore, I can see how for teachers it's very difficult to see how to translate that into the reality of their normal classroom experiences. More recently, so just last year, Gorison and Neilham also conducted an international review on inclusive education, and they referred to Attila's article. So that's quite an interesting way to see how things have changed or not over the last decade. And they note that since our earlier review, there is now much more focus on classrooms as communities, the sort of the whole learning space of the classroom. And for me, that's a good thing. But unfortunately, they're still quite critical because they say even though there's a focus on developing classrooms as inclusive communities, they argue that the findings from this are very limited because they don't show how more inclusive practices are to be achieved. So we're back with the same concerns for teachers, actually. Indeed, they go on to describe themselves as being quite uneasy with the lack of empirical evidence concerning how such communities are to be established. For me as a researcher, this emphasises the need to learn with and from teachers so that together we can understand more deeply the complexity of everyday classroom life and the challenges and successes they encounter as they develop their inclusive classroom practices. Okay, so that's the kind of the four key areas contextually that are shaping my thinking and my research in the study I'm going to talk about this morning, but also my other work. But I'm just going to give a little bit of theoretical background to the study as well. And I hope you'll be able to see the links between the theoretical background and these four areas of context. So I'm going to now turn to the rather complex notion of inclusive education. If you read any book on inclusive education, I probably have written this sort of stuff myself too, or articles, the one thing that all the authors share is they say it's a very complex term and nobody really fully agrees what it means. And if I asked us in this room what our views would be, we would all come up with slightly different definitions. So what I'd like to unpick a little bit is what I understand and how it's shaping my research in terms of the difference between inclusive education, inclusive practice, and inclusive pedagogy. So this is my view, and perhaps while I'm explaining it, you might want to reflect on what your view would be. So for me, inclusive education is about broad political, social, and cultural processes that shape school and education systems. So it's about all children and young people being educated together. So when inclusive education was first theorised, it was very much looking at children with disabilities, and we can see that in the work of UNESCO, for example, the Salamanca Statement. But if you were to go onto the UNESCO website now, you will see that they have a much broader understanding. But it's still about systemic approaches to education, but it's about children who might be marginalised and stigmatised for whatever reasons. So, for example, because of poverty, gender, sexuality, as well as disability. Whereas inclusive practice, I think, is concerned with activities and actions, the things that professionals in schools and other educational settings do that give meaning to the concept and values that underpin inclusive education. And for Lani and myself in our study, as I hope to demonstrate, we define inclusive pedagogy as an approach to teaching and learning which focuses on extending what is generally available to everybody as opposed to providing for all by differentiating for some. So not starting with making provision for most and then something additional or different for some, but for everyone. And the second kind of theoretical orientation I want us to think about is this problem I see with additional needs, which is the traditional approach to inclusive education. And I think it's very closely allied really to paradigms around special educational needs, and I think that's part of the tension in the more traditional view. So these are the areas I'll be looking at here. So dilemma of difference is an expression that is a notion that's been explored by Bram Norwich, who's a psychologist at Exeter University. And he argues there is a dilemma for teachers when thinking about learner diversity, in that, so this is the dilemma that teachers are faced, whether to recognise and respond or not to recognise or respond to difference. As either way, there are some negative implications or risks associated with stigma, devaluing, rejection, or denial of relevant and quality opportunities. So if a child is in the class and has a particular learning difficulty and you provide something different or additional to that child, you might be marginalising them because you're providing something different. But if you ignore their differences, then you might be marginalising them because you're not responding to it. And that's a dilemma that teachers face. Our argument is that by focusing on the difference of individuals in that way, you're more likely to reinforce than to solve that dilemma. So by starting with the fact that the class is full of a diverse range of children, because that's the nature of what it is to be human, and start with the fact that everyone is different, and think about approaches that can be usefully, and strategies that can be made useful and accessible to all children, then some of those dilemmas of difference can be resolved. It's not about denying differences, but it's recognising that difference is part of the human condition. So I like this quotation by Minnow, who says, what counts as difference and what difference does difference make? And I think that's part of the challenge for teachers when thinking about inclusive pedagogy. And part of this is related to understandings of the categorical approach. I'll just give you a chance to have a look at the cartoon here. What I think this cartoon tells us is that the categorical approach and their associated labels are problematic because categories are constructs. They support a deficit model of learning. They place the fault in the learner rather than encourage an exploration of the learning context. And I don't just mean the relationship between the teacher and the child, but all the children in the classroom and indeed other adults. Categories often overlap. And they oversimplify the richness and complexity of children's lives. There are also huge variations between people identified as members of the same group. So an example from England, and I know it's a more generic term, but it's interesting, I think, the statistics around this. We use the term special educational needs to help us decide around provision for children, and I think it's a similar term in New Zealand. Okay, so Ofsted, who's our inspectorate, also undertake quite a lot of research, and they did a large-scale survey across a large number of schools. And they noted that in some schools, fewer than 5% of the children are identified as having special educational needs, and in other schools, more than 70%. So that's a huge range, between 5 and 70%. So then they try to unpick that by saying, well, is it something to do with socioeconomic background, admissions policies of the schools? And yes, that did have an influence, but they could find the same range in all types of schools. Now, what I think is interesting, therefore, is what does that category of special educational needs mean for a professional? So when I work with student teachers, they might, when they see me, say, I've got 5 children in my class who've been identified as having special educational needs. What if they're in one of the fewer than 5% schools or in one of the more than 70% schools? Have they actually identified every child with special educational needs? Or might there be some children who should be so identified? Or might there be some children who shouldn't have been identified? And yet this is a term we use. We make decisions about funding, about provision, about pedagogy based on that category. And it seems to me quite a wobbly one. I'm not to say that some categories aren't more useful, but I think we should take them all with some caution and think about what they mean. Of course, knowing that a child has autism is important, or a child has a hearing impairment. But it's also important to know that a learner is 6 or 16 or 46, or that they're a girl or a boy. So what does it mean to be a 6-year-old girl with autism or a 16-year-old boy with a hearing impairment and autism? So categories are just a starting point. So whatever can be known about that category will always be limited in the educational purposes it can serve, because the variations between members of a group make it difficult to predict or evaluate provision for each of the individuals within a group. And therefore, what does that mean when we go for the most and some traditional approach to inclusion? So I'm just going to give you one more example from England. Here we can see the kind of challenges that teachers and schools sometimes encounter regarding the categorical approach. This is an extract from the Ofsted's recently published inspection handbook. So if you're an inspector, you have a handbook to make sure you can do your job well, and you visit schools and you have to make decisions about what's happening in that school, and then those decisions are reported. And so it's really, really necessary that inspectors do the best job they can. And this is in the section on judging overall effectiveness. And I'm just going to read the piece out from the handbook. It states that inspection is primarily about evaluating how well individual pupils benefit from the education provided by their school. It is important to test the school's response to individual needs by observing how well it helps all pupils to make progress and fulfil their potential. So that seems a perfectly reasonable thing for an inspector to be doing. It then goes on to note it may be relevant to pay particular attention to the achievement of, and then it lists these groups here. Just give you a chance to look at that. So just to give you a little bit of background, the Equality Act, which is referred to there, and the protected characteristics referred to sex, race, disability, religion or belief, or sexual orientation. The reference to free school meals is a proxy measure for children living in low-income families. So if you look at that list, you might wonder, who should the school be focusing and the inspectors be focusing on in terms of children's achievement? Who are the vulnerable groups? Well, what we realise by looking at it, I think, is it's sort of everyone, yeah? Which is good, because we should be thinking about everybody. But I'm not sure how helpful that is then for teachers who are trying to make sure they respond well to the inspection and make sure they're helping children's learning. Of course, it's important as a teacher to note if boys don't seem to be achieving as well as girls, and thinking about maybe it's something within the content of the pedagogical experiences you're providing. But also, we come back to this problem about when an inspector's looking at that, it's no point looking at the difference just between boys and girls, because what if you're a boy with a disability and you're a high achiever? What if you're a girl from from a Roma background who is eligible for free school meals. So as soon as we start to categorise, we lose the complexity of children's lives, and also make it difficult for teachers to know how to respond to all those many, many complex different needs they have within their class. The other thing I think is really important to take into account is how bell curve thinking is just part of our understanding of schooling. So this is what Fendler and Mussafer have called a structural feature of schooling, and they go on to argue that it's inherently unjust because it perpetuates the inevitability of failure. It's absolutely, I think, still deeply embedded in our understanding of education, schools, teaching and learning. And I would argue it's pernicious, the way that it affects some of the pedagogical decisions that are made. So it's associated with the idea that ability is measurable. Well, that's tricky, I think. We have tests that measure what children can manage in tests on the day they do the tests. It doesn't necessarily measure ability. It suggests that ability is fixed, that there is a so-called normal distribution of ability, that there will always be a curve like this. And because it's measurable and fixed, that ability determines future success or failure in learning. This then links back, I think, to the notions of standards and competitions, as discussed earlier. It reinforces ideas about normal and therefore abnormal learners. It gives us ideas around average and therefore what it means to be above and below average. It also shapes ideas about the assessment of learners, which reinforces again the idea of success and failure. And it seems unlikely to me that can support the development of more inclusive pedagogies. Obviously, I'd like to talk about all these things in much more depth, but I must get on to the research. So this is the last theoretical orientation I would like to refer to, and it goes back to my belief that the research that is undertaken should be supportive of teachers, and research should also start with a deep respect for the job that teachers do, deep intellectual engagement with their daily work. So the idea of craft knowledge has been used by many people in education. It's been recognised, for decades now. But for our project, we particularly drew on the work of Donald McIntyre, who was a colleague of ours at Cambridge. And Donald McIntyre uses this idea of craft knowledge as a way of recognising, valuing and exploring teachers' daily work. So it's taking into account not just what teachers do, their actions, but also why they do what they do, and the values and the beliefs that underpin their decision-making and practice. So in my work more generally, and particularly in this research project I'm going to come to shortly, we're very aware that in schools, teachers develop over time deep knowledge, skills and expertise in which they draw on in the classroom. This craft knowledge is often tacit and intuitive. So if you ask teachers, can you explain to me why you did this the way that you did, they often reply, well, it's just the way I do it, because it's so much part of their embodiment of themselves as professionals. So it's not always easy for teachers to articulate their practice or how they make pedagogical decisions. And that's partly, I think, because some pedagogical decisions are placed on very reflective planning, but actually, for those of us who've been teachers, we know that you're also doing this every lesson, every day when you're teaching. So you have to draw on that tacit knowledge without necessarily being able to articulate the decisions that you've made. So we were interested in our research study about how we could tap into that in a way that we could share it with other teachers that we hoped would then be helpful in terms of our research findings. I just want to say, more recently in England, the idea of craft knowledge has become a rather derogatory term, and that's not how I'm using it. Well, at least so far as the idea of craft knowledge for teachers has been used by some as a way of saying teachers don't need to engage, say, in university courses. They can just learn on the job. So being like an apprentice to, say, an electrician or a plumber, not to say that those aren't very important jobs that require high skills, but you learn alongside another plumber or electrician. Whereas I'm using craft knowledge not in that apprenticeship model, but in the sense of being a real craft person, really honing that craft over years. So it's not to say that it's not an intellectual activity. So in our study, we were keen to see how we could bridge the research practice gap. That's McIntyre refers to that research practice gap between what teachers were doing when they seemed to be doing inclusive pedagogy well, and how we would write about it, and how we could share our findings to feed back into teachers' craft knowledge. Okay, so these are our two research questions. We were interested in the teaching strategies that would help to increase the participation and achievement of all children. And also we wanted to identify examples of inclusive pedagogy using our definition of everybody rather than most and some. We wanted to have those examples in ways that we could therefore share them with other teachers that would be useful and supportive of their practice. So, as I said earlier, I'm a teacher educator, and I'm always keen to make sure that my research feeds back into what I teach when I'm working with colleagues in schools. So for this to happen, it seemed important to us that we worked with teachers where we were likely to see inclusive pedagogy in action. We weren't interested in looking at what didn't work, we were interested in looking at what did and understanding why. So for our study, we worked in two primary schools in this particular study, and we chose them because, first of all, they had very open admissions policies. They accepted any child in their local area, and so they had a wide range of children who perhaps in other areas might not have been within a mainstream setting. They also actually welcoming to children outside their local area who other schools had been less keen to accept. So they saw their school as for everybody, and therefore we were hoping that their pedagogical practices would also reflect that. Also, the staff in the school had been very enthusiastic about the work and were very keen to explore their own practices. So we felt hopeful that we would be able to identify examples of inclusive pedagogy in action. We spent about 6 months in the schools, and we undertook extended observations. And then after we'd done some of the observations, I did a first stage analysis of what we saw, trying to identify strategies that might represent inclusive pedagogy. And then we had extended interviews with the teachers afterwards in our aim of hoping to find ways for the teachers to articulate what they were doing. So here, this triangle of understanding inclusive pedagogy was important to us, because we could observe what the teachers were doing, but we wanted to know more than just what they were doing. We wanted to know why they were doing it, what were the underlying values and beliefs, and what was the knowledge they were drawing on to allow them to do it. So we see these three aspects as being really interrelated and informing each other. And therefore, observing would not be enough. We needed to talk to the teachers as well. So our aim was to identify, if possible, 2, 3 or 4 strategies from each teacher, and then explore those in real depth to give us some examples, not of sort of tips for teachers, but deep pedagogical thinking that we'd observed. So to our findings. We had 3 key findings, and the first 2, I think, are really unexpected. So it's not always easy to maintain this standard of what we understood by inclusive pedagogy as always starting with everyone, that there were challenges and dilemmas for the teachers, and therefore they may engage in varied and contradictory practices. So there are other pressures on teachers to behave in other ways. We understood that. But our third finding, we think, is probably more important. And that was that inclusive pedagogy is defined not in the teacher's choice of strategies, but in their use of them. So their starting point was this sort of mind shift of focusing on all learners rather than most and some. So the strategies we saw the teachers using that we could identify as being around inclusive pedagogy were really ordinary strategies. They weren't doing anything amazingly strange or different, but it was how they used those strategies. And this is quite a subtle shift. Through our observation and interview data, we were able to develop further our understanding of what an inclusive pedagogy might be. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of how, by talking to the teachers, we were able to deepen our understanding. And then I'll give you some examples from the actual data. Okay, so there were 3 major areas that seemed really important in this subtle shift away from the traditional approach to inclusion, which is the child's in the class, but I have to do something different for this child because they're part of my some rather than most group, towards all. So we can see in this first one, it was shifting the focus away from differences to the learning of all children. So it wasn't about denying differences, but it was about teachers choosing to take responsibility for the learning of everyone in their class. It's how they developed their classes as rich learning communities to ensure there were a range of different learning opportunities so everyone was able to participate. It wasn't the teachers did not focus on most children, then make different arrangements for some, but set up their classes with a wide range of resources that would encompass the needs of everybody. But some resources weren't allocated to some children. The resources were for the classroom as a community. And specifically, the teachers focused on what they wanted to teach and how, rather than who, as their starting point. So specifically, it was not about differentiation based on notions of abilities. So we already had an understanding of the headline, as it were, on that slide, but by talking to the teachers, we understood it more deeply. So the other kind of headline we were already interested in through our theoretical understanding was around rejecting deterministic beliefs about ability, and also the idea the presence of some holds back the progress of others. So we knew that from our previous work. But by talking to the teachers, these were some of the key ideas that came through that helps us to enrich that understanding. So these teachers had an absolute belief that all the children in their class will make progress, they will learn, and they will achieve. They saw that as a fundamental right. Didn't mean they'd all learn the same or they'd all make the same progress, but they believed that all children were learners. They focused their teaching on learning what the children could do rather than what they couldn't. So very often in the some and most approach, it's the starting off, well, these children can't do something. They thought very carefully about grouping in the classroom to support everybody's learning. They thought about grouping as part of the community, as part of everybody in the class being a learner and a teacher. And they used assessment to support learning rather than to measure current. It was about the future rather than measuring current attainments as a way of sort of categorising and labelling children. So assessment was thinking forward to support progress. And my third and final key area is seeing difficulties in learning as challenges for teachers rather than deficits in learners, and thinking about developing new ways of working. Now this is a really important point, but what it highlights actually is the effect of the whole school culture. So in both the schools that we were working in, there was a real commitment to finding ways to be more inclusive in their practice. And also the staff were very supportive of one another in that shared endeavour. And this, of course, is not always the case in all schools. However, in these schools, we saw teachers working together in a very supportive way, and head teachers and other senior leaders encouraging them to try new things out, to take risks. If this doesn't work, let's try something else. I think we're quite a risk-averse profession because we feel so scrutinised, but actually unless we try new things out, we won't know what works. It was also about not attributing fault to the child, and also significantly not attributing fault to the teacher when things didn't go well. So I think we run the danger of having deficit teachers, because we say, oh, you can't manage that child, I don't have a problem with him or her. But it wasn't like that in these schools. In these schools, the staff were really, really keen to solve the problem together. So it wasn't just that the teacher was responsible for all the children in their class, or the teachers felt responsible for all the children in the school. It's also about how you work with and through other adults. So here we say to respect the dignity of learners as full members of the community of the classroom. And that's particularly about working with what we would call teaching assistants, but I think you call teacher aides here, to see that the teacher aide would be a resource for the whole class. And yes, they might have a particular focus on certain children, but that would be done in ways that wouldn't isolate that child from the rest of the group. And also it's about being committed to understanding that teaching requires continuing professional development. Okay, well, rather briefly now to the finding, some of the actual findings themselves. So here's an extract from one teacher. So I'm calling her Helen, and she's in her 4th year of teaching, and she's working with a class of 11 to 12-year-olds. And she's describing here the strategy that we then identified as work choice. And this is a really ordinary strategy that happens in schools all the time, but it's her thinking about it that I think is important. So that's why I wanted to show it to you today, because it's not anything particularly unusual. So in this example, Helen had been reading a poem to her class about the moon by Robbie Burns, and she wanted them then to write their own moon poem. So, like lots of teachers, she sets out 3 possible activities. One activity is that they copy out the poem that they were given originally, but some of the key describing words, the adjectives and adverbs, have been taken out, and they're asked to think about their own. So that's a sort of fairly straightforward task. Another task they could do would be to copy out the first 2 lines of each stanza and then write the rest of the poem for themselves. The third activity is to write a poem about the moon. So she's offered them differentiated tasks. What's different, though, is that she allows them to choose which task they do themselves. She doesn't decide that the easier task is for the less able children and the hard task is for the more able children. And to allow this to happen, she doesn't just do it without talking to the children, and they've spent quite a lot of time prior to this session talking about what it is to be a learner, about making good learning choices, for example. So not always going for the easy task, for example, or not going for a task that you might find difficult. She talks them through what it is, those metacognitive skills about being a good learner. But also she's aware that there is a huge range of needs within that group, so she has to make sure that the resources that she provides for the class allows them to be able to engage in this task in ways that suits them. So she provides the original poems on the wall. They've already done a group activity as a class, identifying key words that could be used, and that's on the wall. They've got websites about the moon, they've got pictures about the moon, they've done paintings on the moon. So there's lots of stuff that's going on that fills up the classroom as a community of learners to support them. And what is also interesting here, as you can see in the quotation, she says she'd already done the same kind of activity the year before. And she said, I learned that from last year's group, they felt they weren't as good as the others, so they were quite embarrassed about it if they had to do the easier task. It's better to have the option. So we can see from this that previously she'd done the same activity, but she'd decided who was to do the task. And through her thinking, her developing inclusive practice thinking, she's begun to think that that's actually marginalising some children. She says they know what's expected of them, so why can't they just give it a go on their own? So differentiation can be used in ways that support inclusive pedagogy and in ways that don't. What was interesting for me when I was observing this class was that there were a group of girls, and in that group there were 2 children who had recently arrived at the school for whom English wasn't their first language. And they had decided as a little group they were going to do the easier task because they felt that was right for them. They did the first stanza and they thought, I could see they were thinking, yeah, that's okay, we can manage that. So they then decided to actually create a different version of a differentiated task, separate from any one that Helen had given them, because for the second stanza they moved on to the middle level task and did the one where they wrote the last, copied out the first 2 lines and then completed it themselves. And then they felt so confident from doing that that they moved on to the third differentiated task to finish the poem and just did some free writing of their own. And when I asked Helen about that, she thought that was great. She didn't see that as them not doing what they were told. They were being good learners. They were scaffolding their own learning. They were learning together. And so in that way, they were able to be accommodated within the everybody, but a task that suited their needs and gave them the confidence to do the work they wanted to do. Now, the reason why I think this is a helpful example is it's really ordinary. It's not very different from what teachers do all the time. It's to do with Helen's mindset that she didn't want to stigmatise some children as being different. The way she set up her class was very interesting. They had a huge amount of choice. They even had a choice about when they did this activity, and I'd love to tell you more about it, but I can't. But so one of the things, because there's lots of different things happening, so some children might be writing the poem while other children are doing their maths or other children are doing art, and it did take time to establish that and make it work, but it was very flexible and supportive. But it also meant the other really important resource they had in the class was each other. So if I was struggling to write my poem, I could come to one of you because I know you've already done it and your work's already up on the wall. I could look at your poem, or I could come and talk to you and you could help me with my poem. And I thought that was brilliant. So it also released Helen to have a lot of time to actually work with children because they could use each other as a resource. Obviously she had to have times during the day where she made input into the sessions, and have whole class teaching. She also had to be very careful that children were actually working properly throughout the day, but it worked very well. And I felt a lot of what she was doing was also really helping the children to think about themselves as being good learners. So there was one lad I remember arriving on a Monday morning and he was doing his maths, and I said, so why have you chosen to do maths this morning? He said, well, I really hate maths. So I thought I'd just get it out of the way. And I thought that's a great skill to have learned. It's probably a skill I haven't really fully developed yet. So well done him, So she saw the whole class as a resource. The class was set out, so there were individual tables. So for some children who preferred to work on their own because that's their learning, the way they like to learn, they could do things on their own. Other children could work in pairs or larger groups. It's very, very flexible. So I think what's significant about this one small example is it shows that subtle shift in Helen's thinking away from an individualised approach to inclusion, where her focus is on, I've got a variety of needs in this class, I must provide a variety of tasks and tell the children which ones to do, to an approach where she starts with everybody having the same opportunities but makes sure that the resources and the activities she provides allows everybody to make progress and to learn. It wasn't her choice of strategy, this very ordinary thing about differentiation, but the way that she arranged her class to allow that to happen. And of course a very important practical point is this required no extra work on her part than how she'd done it the year before, because the year before she had the same resources, she devised the same activities as she did in the subsequent year. It's just the children learnt in a different way. Okay, so it says peer group collaborative learning, and this is just another example But what we've done here is this is the kind of materials that Lani and I have been developing to work when we're doing our teaching. So this is another teacher. This is Kate in the other school, who also teaches a class of children aged about 11 to 12. So this column here is what we saw her doing, okay, the everybody approach. And then we've got these two other columns, which Lani and I made up. They're completely fictitious, okay? But what we've done is we've tried to understand what was happening here and then to reinvent it under the individualised approach to inclusion, so that when we're working with student teachers and other teachers, we can look at the contrast between these columns here. So again, the strategy that Kate was using is peer group collaborative learning. Again, very sort of ordinary thing, putting groups of children together to learn together. And what we saw in Kate's lesson is that she'd asked them to do get into groups, and then there were a number of individual tasks that they needed to do, and also some group activities. And she allowed them to decide who was going to do what. And that was quite tricky for some of them, because some of the tasks nobody really wanted to do, so they had to learn to be good collaborators, perhaps do a task they were less keen on, because everybody wanted to do one particular one, which looked more fun, say, or they might have to do a task that was slightly outside their kind of comfort zone. But also it meant they had to make that kind of collaborative decision together and learn together. And then also in that class, there was a young lad he identified as having social emotional behaviour difficulties. And she was very keen to make sure that he would have the opportunity to fully collaborate within the group that he was in, and in ways that didn't isolate him because of the way that the teacher aide who was supporting him was positioned. So we could see a really inclusive pedagogical approach running through that, because she started off thinking, how can everyone be part of this? And there were other children in the class with a variety of special educational needs, if we were going to use that category. But how might she have done it differently if she'd have taken the more inclusive approach to inclusion? And we can see in the left-hand column, well, she might have decided that individual tasks need to be differentiated according to learners' identified ability levels. So that would be inclusive insofar as the students would be doing tasks that were deemed appropriate for their needs. She might seek advice from learning support staff about the appropriateness of the materials and the tasks for certain children. And she might think that to make sure that happens well, she'll select the more able students to lead the group tasks. She might also think, because she's using collaborative learning, that the classmates can support other students as well, so that would be inclusive. With regard to this young boy with social emotional behaviour difficulties, the learning support assistant or teacher aide would work alongside him to make sure that his collaboration was facilitated. So you can see that is an inclusive aspect of working on the more traditional approach. However, we would argue that it's also exclusive in some ways, because some students, now I'm in the middle column, would see that individuals are set different tasks according to teachers' assessments of their ability. They notice that clever students are chosen to lead group activities. Some students are perceived as needing help. They might also be given tasks that limits expectations. And also, if the teacher aide is working closely with the boy who's identified as having social emotional behaviour difficulties, actually that collaboration may be curtailed because of her presence. So we tried to set this up, nothing different, there's no different planning in a sense, there's no extra resources required, but her starting point is how can everybody have the same opportunities to engage in what's happening in the classroom. And in the interview with Kate, later when I asked her about this, I particularly talked to her about the young man who I'll call Thomas here, who was the boy identified with social and emotional behaviour difficulties. And I think this is a helpful example, particularly for student teachers who are often concerned about managing children who have challenging behaviour in schools. Because Thomas was a child who'd been excluded from a number of schools before he came to this particular school. So he wasn't a local boy, had to travel quite far to get there. He'd been not only excluded from a couple of mainstream schools, but also from a special school for children identified with behaviour difficulties. He was then being home tutored, but then no home tutor chose to work with him. So at age 9, so it's about 18 months before this lesson I observed, he was out of education completely. And I think if we're thinking about what that means to be a 9-year-old and out of education, what that would mean to be a 19-year-old and a 29-year-old, well, what is the future for a child like that? And if we go back to concerns about costs and outcomes, apart from the moral dilemma, that's going to be costly to society. Anyway, it wasn't just that Thomas could easily just pitch up and join in a lesson like that. A huge amount had to happen before that lesson that I saw took place. He arrived with 2 teacher aides of his own, which is quite unusual, because that would be expensive too. They were both trained in restraint, because his behaviour could be very frightening for himself and for others. They had walkie-talkies to summon extra help if they needed it. So it's not that this inclusive pedagogy that I observed happened instantly. A lot had to happen. Very small steps had to be taken over a long period of time for Thomas to be more fully engaged in this lesson. But when I saw it, I could not have identified who he was, which is quite remarkable considering how he arrived in the school. And when I talked to the teacher about him, she said to me, the main thing is he doesn't want to be seen as different. So making him be a child with a sort of Velcro teacher aide next to him would not help him. Also, she said in the interview that what he'd missed most of all from being out of school so much was he didn't know, he needed to learn how to be with other children. He needed to learn how to be a child in a class. And having a teacher aide with him would not support that. So removing him from the class was not going to help. Having a teacher aide constantly with him was going to curtail this kind of social engagement that he needed to learn. So anyway, so we have a number of sheets like this, and we work on them with student teachers, and then we ask them to think about their own practice and where they place them in these columns and what they could do to make it look different. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up now. The slides will be available and all the references, so these are just some general principles. I suppose for me, the headlines are actually really that it can be challenging and demanding work in the context of other pressures and demands in education. I don't think any teacher can do it all the time. It's easier to do it in a school where there's a supportive culture. But when I'm asked by student teachers how they're going to manage to be more inclusive in their pedagogical approaches, they won't always be working in a school where they get that support. So my advice to them is take one small step, find one small space, perhaps on Friday or Tuesday next week, and just have a go. Just do one small thing and see how it works, where you start off with everybody rather than most and some, and see what difference that might make. So I do believe that spaces can be found in any classroom and school. So, this is my last slide. Alongside what I think we've found out about the teacher's work by listening carefully to what they had to say, I also really want to respect the work of Donald McIntyre and his emphasis on the importance of an open exploratory approach based on a deep respect for the work that teachers do. And this reference is at the end of the slide, and Donald wrote this paper and it was published posthumously. He died between doing the final draft and it being published. And it looked specifically at supporting teachers to develop inclusive pedagogy. He was just developing an interest in that himself, and that would have been really exciting to have worked with him on that. But also for me, it's a very important link back to the University of Canterbury, because Donald often referred to the work of Graham Nuttall, who was a professor here. And so to me, it's very important to have those opportunities to make those connections. And you'll see this is the picture of the Faculty of Education at Cambridge again, where I shall be returning shortly. But also it's since Donald's death, it's been called the Donald McIntyre Building. So I just wanted to end with that. Thank you.